I am so excited to be here today with Sophia Kianni. Welcome, Sophia.
Thank you.
Sophia is a rising junior at Stanford University. She is also the founder of Climate Cardinals, a organization that looks to translate climate information to over 100 languages. Sophia is also youth advisor to the UN Secretary General. So, Sophia, let's start with that hat on first. Talk to us about these global climate goals and why there is such an urgency to actually ensure that we reach our emissions targets. And what is the role of nature based solutions in all of this?
I think part of the reason why it's so important to look at these specific emissions targets and the goals that the UN is setting is because even looking at the most recent IPCC report, it seems like there's almost no viable pathway towards staying below 1.5 degrees. And when we're specifically talking about the role of nature-based solutions, I mean, they're proven, they're scalable. Indigenous people have already been protecting so much of our world's biodiversity for centuries, really. And so I think it's up to us to make sure that we're taking this specific science-based approach to informing how we go about climate action.
So, we obviously need to support those local communities that can really benefit from nature based solutions. Of course, all solutions, but in particular, those that help restore and conserve the environments that are indigenous. And of course, that has a ripple effect and is helpful for all communities within the region and then more globally. How do we begin to think about financing this, though? This is the kind of thing that you hear a lot from communities, and those who speak out on behalf of these indigenous communities are not being supported at all. So we're not actually reaching that 100 billion goal that we promised in terms of financial support. We're falling short of that, much less even coming up with more financing to support nature-based solutions. So talk to us about what needs to happen in terms of financing and supporting these communities.
Well, I think there are a variety of different routes that we can use to gain funding. And I definitely think that in addition to galvanizing government support, especially for, like you were saying, this $100 billion climate pledge is going to be critical because it's developing nations that need to be able to invest in new renewable and clean energy infrastructure that can have long lasting change. But in addition to that, I think that the private sector has such a role to play in terms of advancing climate philanthropy. And so I'm really excited to see how, like, for example, Salesforce has gotten more involved and been giving more money towards organizing platforms for Indigenous people and climate activists to be talking about what's happening in their community so that they can galvanize fundraising support. Because I think that ultimately those who are on the front lines, people of color, women, children who are being disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, they understand what their communities need. And we need to make sure that both governments, the public sector, as well as the private sector are doing their part to ensure that we have enough funding in the space.
Thank you for sharing that. Let's expand on that a little bit. Let's talk more about the role of the private sector. How can the private sector support the financing of some of these great solutions and support the scaling of these solutions as well? How do you think about that?
I think that there are a lot of roles that corporations can play, but I think that it definitely first assessing their own corporate responsibility and the ESG metrics that they have as a company. I think that it does start with personal change and committing to going carbon neutral, et cetera. And then beyond that, I think that committing money towards investing in nature-based solutions, giving back to community organizers and nonprofit, and engaging in these public-private partnerships that we've seen more of. Like I've seen companies going out and pledging a specific amount of donation to amazing grassroots nonprofits, and I definitely think that there should be more of that.
Well, those are exactly the type of efforts that we applaud on the We Don't Have Time platform as well, and that we would give climate love to. So thank you for pointing out the importance of that. We know that the private sector has a significant role to play to see nature-based solutions actually come into fruition. From your climate cardinals perspective, so switching hats, because you wear many hats and all of them are extremely relevant and important for the work that we're trying to collectively do here, which is ultimately to reach those global climate goals, right? So with your climate cardinals hat on, what have you seen and heard in terms of awareness around nature-based solutions?
Looking at it through my climate cardinals lens, I definitely think that nature-based solutions are a talking point in the climate movement, but I don't think enough. I think that too much emphasis and effort is going towards unproven solutions like carbon capture, where we see so much money being invested in this industry, where I think obviously it's important to champion technology solutions and innovation. But on the same token, we already have renewable energy resources and solutions that are proven and scalable. And scientists have been saying for decades that we already have the tools we need to rapidly decarbonize. And I think that continuing to invest in that and scaling up those efforts, especially in areas like Africa, I think is one of the main ways that we can make sure that we're championing pragmatic climate action instead of letting these oil and gas companies get away with investing their money in efforts that might not even come to fruition.
Why is it that nature-based solutions are not being picked up when they actually are the lowest hanging fruit in many ways?
I mean, I guess it's not glamorous or sexy to say, like, I mean, trees are the easiest, cheapest, simplest solutions we have, and that all goes back down to nature-based solutions. I think that even the media and the public is so captivated by this idea that we can have this huge technology breakthrough and make these carbon capture devices, but I honestly think that a lot of it falls back to the fact that people want to preserve the status quo. And the mythical idea that some carbon capture device will be created so that we can maintain business as usual is quite likely a fantasy. And I think that people need to become more comfortable with the idea that maybe sometimes it is best to use this old school lens and to realize that we need to put an enormous amount of funding and effort into making sure that we are funding reforestation while also investing money in technology innovation and seeing like maybe there is a possibility and a role that carbon capture can play. But given that it's still uncertain, we should still rely on tried and true and proven solutions like nature-based solutions that are cheap, cost-effective, and scalable.
We have limited resources and we're struggling to come up with this 100 billion that we have pledged to those countries that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and even have very little to do with what we're seeing globally now in terms of impacts of the planet warming. So, of course, it sounds like it makes sense to go for the most cost-effective solutions. Yeah. So, is that how the UN thinks about it from your capacity as a UN youth advisor? How do you see the UN prioritizing solutions that we can put forward?
Well, as part of the UN's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, we've held a series of consultations with young people from over 20 countries where we basically asked them what their key climate priorities are. And one of their key climate priorities was ensuring that we are protecting the world's biodiversity and forests, specifically given that they are home to so many Indigenous people and prioritizing the voice and inclusion of Indigenous people in climate conversations. And I think that that's something that we have relayed to the UN Secretary General, and he has also relayed to both world leaders and the public. So I definitely do think that the stance that we have presented is that nature-based solutions are going to be a critical part of all of these conversations.
Awesome. Well, thank you for everything you do, the many hats you wear, and you are just at the start of being a real climate advocate. I see an incredible career ahead of you. Appreciate you so much for taking the time. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back, everyone, to Restoration Conversations. I'm thrilled to have with me today Yee Lee. Yee is one of the first team members, if not the first team member, to join Terraformation, and he currently serves as the VP of Growth. So he's focused on finding ways to help foresters be more successful and to start more new forestry projects in order to accelerate the growth of, okay, this is a tongue twister, global regenerative forest restoration industries. So this is what we're looking to do here with our conversation with the VP of Growth is really get into how we are going to see this industry take off. And who better to have this conversation than somebody who has a background in growth and engineering and finance. He's a serial entrepreneur and founder. He began his career in Silicon Valley. He was with PayPal early on, and over the course of 25 years has served in engineering and product management roles at companies like you may or may not have heard of eBay, Google, Facebook. So this is a very well qualified person to answer some outstanding questions we still have in this series. mainly around how are we actually going to do this, Yee? How are we going to find the funds to finance nature-based solutions? Let's start there.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. And it is such a pressing question, right? Because we talk about creation of 3 billion acres of net new forest or planting 1 trillion trees. These are such huge numbers that we just intuitively know it's going to take a lot of money. It's going to take a lot of financial support to start that much forestry. So uh, let me just start off with what the world has done to date. And that has been to come up with mechanisms like forestry bonds and green bonds. And there's increasing talk about blended capital structures that are going to throw billions of dollars at forestry projects, which is really exciting to hear about it. I think we love to hear about these conservation forestry bonds that are funding Red Plus and carbon forestry projects. But the key thing that I think we have to realize is protecting the forests that we already have. Valuable, really valuable thing to do, and definitely a lot of carbon credits to be generated from that activity. But we need to go beyond protecting the forests that we have to actually planting just hundreds of times more forests than we're protecting. I think the stat is literally the world loses something like 25 million acres of forest each year to deforestation, which is a huge number, and it's a total shame, and we have to stop that. But the world needs 3 billion acres of new forest, and that's like literally more than 100 times more, right, than the forest that we're losing each year. So thinking about like how do we invert that balance and apply hundreds of times more financing effort to the creation of new forests, like that's the challenge at hand. And it's going to take new funding mechanisms. I think one of Terraformation's just founding thesis or hypothesis is that uh, it'll take different and new funding structures to be able to afford and to align economic incentives for all stakeholders around new forests. And here's just one example of this. If you think about a brand new forest, it's literally starting with degraded land that doesn't have trees on it today, or maybe has been severely overgrazed, some scenario like that, and you're talking about growing brand new trees, like planting new trees from scratch, so to speak. It's going to be years, right? It's going to be potentially 5, potentially 8 years before there are sufficiently large trees and sufficiently numerous trees to be able to go and measure using current carbon standards to go measure carbon credits. And if that's the case, then already, like right there, you can see how like a bond funding mechanism or a project finance debt mechanism that requires consistent repayment each year, right, starting from the first year of initiation, that kind of instrument is just not going to be appropriate for brand new forests because they just can't afford to pay right up front. So we're going to have to come up with new funding mechanisms. One of the most intriguing I think mechanisms that we've come across so far is this idea of blending philanthropic and equity capital together to be able to go afford new forests. And maybe we could talk more about that in this session. But I do think that there's ways for us to go do this, but it's going to take a little bit of financial engineering as well as on the ground work to be able to create new forests.
How much money do we need? So we need to raise money 100 times, like you just said, to be able to see through these nature-based solutions. And we also need to be able to raise money to support these existing locations that really the world has promised support for, to build resiliency against current impacts and future impacts of climate. How much money do we really need to restore the world's native forests and beyond?
So I think the current estimates are that it will take somewhere between $500 billion to $2 trillion of total global investment over the next, let's call it a decade and a half, to be able to actually create the amount of forests that the world needs created in order to offset the gigatons of carbon dioxide, or to resequester the gigatons of carbon dioxide that have been released up into the atmosphere. So that's a big number. When we talk about as soon as we start talking about capital T trillions of dollars, I think a lot of folks will start to compare that to like, financial GDP numbers from certain nations, right? And start to realize like, okay, we're talking really large sums of money. I would ask folks to put that in a different context though, rather than thinking about it as like, the entire income or gross production of certain nations. I would ask folks to think about it in terms of the investment, because that's really what a forestry investment is. It's an investment in assets, right? These durable long-term assets are going to create economic value. Well, we have lots of investments like that in the world. One of the best benchmarks, I think, is actually our collective, our global societal collective investment in development of housing and commercial properties. Right? If you look at the amount of money that's been sunk into creating homes and businesses, like the structures, the physical buildings that businesses go in, it's actually about $120 trillion that the world today, assets under management today, holds in current assets for our stock of housing, and that's just the mortgage value, right? Like the debt that's gone into these properties, not even like the property values themselves, which can, I mean, some estimates will go up into the quadrillions. It's crazy, right? So right, like there are huge sums of money that humanity, I think, is capable of directing into assets that produce long-term economic value, and that's actually, I think, the right framing for how we should think about an investment in forestry.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, that all sounds really good. Are there any risks we should be aware of? What are the risks involved in forest restoration, and what can we do to mitigate against those now?
Yeah. Yeah. So risk, I mean, anytime we're talking about financial topics, I think risk is a really important aspect to consider. And this is actually where I feel like some of the best financial innovation can actually happen in the space. Today, the financial arrangements around bonds, around project finance debt, these are very low risk kinds of, or very, very low risk tolerance kinds of financial vehicles, right? Like if you've got a bond investor that has put money into a particular project, they need to be really, really sure that the project is going to work and that they're going to get a certain coupon rate or a certain interest rate delivered back to the bond investor. So they're not really willing to tolerate forestry risks or early stage forestry risk where maybe you start a brand new project and the plant, or you have to change plans a few times before you find the right species that's actually going to be able to sustain a long-term regenerative forestry project. Or maybe there's very unfortunate scenarios that can happen when you're talking about climate impacted areas, forest fires, flooding, droughts, right? There's all these different risks that can affect forestry project performance. And they won't really be characterized until you've gotten a decade or more of experience with a particular project site. So having these very low risk tolerance financial investors try to participate in early stage forestry, like the act of getting a new forest started, is actually kind of a mismatch. Like there's not really a good fit between their risk tolerance versus what the forest is going to perform as a financial asset. So this is where I feel like financial innovation can happen if we look at other classes of investment for investors who are willing to take on riskier or sort of high, medium to higher risk kinds of investments. Like where do we find these kinds of examples? Well, it turns out if you look at the tech sector, if you look at startups, there's many examples of how to structure riskier pools of riskier investments. Generally, this has a lot to do with portfolio theory and just diversifying across enough different investments in a portfolio so that you have sort of buffered the risk from any one individual project failing by being able to diversify across ideally uncorrelated regions, uncorrelated types of forestry, and being able to again buffer right any losses there, and to structure those investments in a way so that the investors who participate early on get outsized gains, right, are able to participate meaningfully in the carbon sequestration production that these projects can produce over time. And so finding ways to do that, right, to entice the right class of investor to come and participate in early stage forestry, and then graduating the projects that are making it to larger and larger scale, graduating them to lower risk tolerance kinds of investors. I think that's actually the trick, right? Or that's actually really the financial engineering work that'll have to happen.
So I think this leads well into my next question. If we're creating these funding sources that should be attractive to restorationists, including early stage restoration projects. So is it kind of like set it up and they will come? Will that allow the access? Or is there some way to to provide access outside of what we just described, or what you just described so eloquently?
I think that so this is where I maybe border into just personal conjecture because we don't know exactly how the space is going to evolve. Um, but personally, I think that there's going to be a combination of factors that really helps this early stage forest financing sector start to blossom. The first, of course, is just jumping in and doing it, starting to provide the examples of like here's a fund, here's how it's structured, here's the kinds of investments that it's making, and here's how that fund is performing. And Terraformation is in the act of doing exactly that. We've announced a partnership with Bankers Without Boundaries to create a blended $100 million blended finance fund with which we are going to go create a bunch of forestry projects and fund them, and we'll report back on how they're doing. There's other efforts afoot at Terraformation to help accelerate and incubate new forestry teams, and we'll be very open and transparent about how those funds and vehicles are performing over time, so that others can look at the example and decide if they want to copy it or not. Another thing that we can do formally in the space is to literally make a lot of our efforts open source. So it's not just kind of read about an effort in the news and kind of try to guess how they did it or how they pulled it off, but literally to be able to go download a set of legal documents on, if you want to create a fund, here's an open source template, legal template and set of contracts that you could use, anybody could use to create an early stage forestry fund and figure out how they want to plug other parties into that contract. Like I think that's actually been one of the key things that again, borrowing from the sort of tech sector, that space has done really well. They've open sourced a lot of the financing documents so that entrepreneurs can literally go download the documents and not need to engage like a very high priced lawyer in order to actually create the right legal structure for a financing.
Yeah, that's incredible. I love how you think about this. And it's really clear that Terraformation and the private sector more broadly has a role to play here and can
Mm.
really accelerate some of these nature based solutions that are being put forward, that are underway, that the UN is behind. How can the private sector help more broadly?
So in this space, very specifically, anybody who's out there today, any corporate actor who's out there today with an ESG team or a climate sustainability team, maybe they've made a climate pledge or a carbon neutral pledge to reach carbon neutral by 2030, 2040, 2050. There's a number of these kinds of pledges that I think we all hear about popularly now. Which is great to see, but everybody who's out there trying to buy carbon credits today has already run into the problem. There's just not enough carbon credits to go around, right? Every single carbon buyer that I talk to in the last 6 months has reported back the same kinds of findings and feelings, which is, wow, I didn't realize it was actually so competitive to try to actually bid on carbon projects. And now I feel like I'm actually getting cut off of enough carbon supply to be able to fulfill the carbon demand that I've already committed to, right? That we need in order to there's a certain number of carbon credits that each corporation or each municipality or even just families, as they're trying to purchase carbon offsets to be able to sequester carbon dioxide on their own behalf, right? Everybody's running out of the ability to buy sufficient carbon credits. So I would just ask everybody who's out there as a corporate carbon buyer to think about, do they want to continue to compete for the same small supply of carbon credits and continue to bid up sort of against other buyers, like the price of a single carbon ton, or would they like to allocate some of their resources to be able to increase the pool, the supply pool of carbon credits? That's actually, I think, the sort of mindset switch that I think is going to be the single most helpful thing for corporate entities to do, or private sector entities to do, which is flip from a buy mode, right, a transactional purchase. I'm just going to come to an entity and try to buy some carbon credits, to flip from a transactional buy mode into an investing mode. How can we invest in carbon credits, sequestration assets called forests? How can we invest in these things and be part of their long-term success? I think that's actually the single thing that the private sector can do the
That's
most.
awesome. So we're talking about big picture. To bring it back to forestry, how is TF, like you've already touched on it, but let's get into how TF is attracting more financing for forestry projects. So of course, putting yourselves out there, leading by example. What specifics can you tell us? How do we get more financing into nature-based solutions, specifically around reforestation.
All right. Well, I teased about this a little bit up front, but let's talk about it now. One of the things that I'm most excited about, one of the new concepts that I'm most excited about, is actually this idea of creating forestry incubators to help teams, new forestry teams all around the world, get started, and to really think of them literally as startup companies, as small business entities where these entrepreneurs have this grand vision of creating a forest in their local region, but they don't necessarily have all the resources, they don't have the staffing, they don't have the training, they don't have the equipment yet in order to realize this vision. Okay, so very typically, right, like in many developed economies around the world, there are startup incubators, there are regional, like city hosted, like small business incubators and boot camps where a small business operator might get paired together with mentors and financial resources in order to actually realize this vision, right? That concept applied to forestry, I think, could be super, super powerful. Terraformation is definitely, we are in the act of trying to structure and create exactly that kind of incubation relationship. And this I think is a really interesting concept, not only, of course, for the forester teams themselves, but also for investors, because we're coming back to financing and how do we plug dollars in to get trees out at the end of the day. So incubators are great financial investment engines. You can put dollars in to an incubator and get out that sort of diversified pool of investments that I spoke about earlier on, and to be able to pool funds together into regionally focused incubators, and then invest systematically in dozens or hundreds of new forest teams all at the same time. I think that's a really, really key idea, that incubators can not only aggregate the supply, if you will, of new forest teams, but then also aggregate the demand for dollars going into them, and be able to be that disbursement point for financial resources, for training of new teams, and for the creation of the legal and technical creation of these new forest entities. So really excited about that concept. It's borrowed, of course. This is maybe no new ideas under the sun. It's a borrowed concept from the tech space, from like the city and municipal sort of small business planning space. Many sectors have successfully created incubators or accelerators before. I love the potential for applying this idea to forestry teams.
Yeah, why reinvent the wheel? Let's actually break down some silos across sectors, see what's working, cross communicate, and apply. We need everybody to contribute solutions to the climate crisis, right? And these solutions are quite literally growing dollar bills on trees. Weren't we told as kids, like, dollar bills don't grow on trees? From everything you're
Right.
telling me, this is like that old adage no longer applies.
Yes. Well, and maybe just rip more broadly, to help people recognize that standing trees have value, right? That a tree doesn't have to be cut down to create economic value, but that like a standing tree, and ideally many stands of trees, forests, right, have economic value in and of themselves, just as living ecosystems.
Yeah, fantastic. I love that. And thank you for sharing that example with us, because it gives us more insight into some of the work that's out there. And you explained some more financial concepts that aren't obvious to people like myself. So I'm sure our audience is appreciating the explanation and how you describe the blended finance instruments, the creative new tools that are in our toolkit that we can deploy, how we think about assets, and how we frame the narrative as, look at how much money is actually out there. It seems like a lot, but we also already have a ton out there. And we can take creative avenues that have been used in the tech sector and other sectors and apply them to this climate crisis and the solutions for overcoming the climate crisis, in a way that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can actually just collaborate, come together, share good ideas, scale solutions.
Couldn't have said it any better. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it, Yee. Thank you. Appreciate you being here. Keep up the awesome work. Thank you to TF for everything that it is doing in this space, and look forward to having another conversation again soon. Thank you.
Okay. Sure.